Hi, my name is Tom, and I'm 32 years old. Until recently, I thought my life was pretty simple and straightforward. I grew up in a small rural town where everyone knows everyone. Life here is quiet, sometimes too quiet, but it's home. I've always been close to my family, especially my parents. They worked hard their entire lives to give me a good life, and for the most part, I've always felt lucky to have them. My parents, like many families in our town, take pride in what they've built over the years. They own a decent piece of land that has been in our family for generations. It's not huge, but it's beautiful. There are rolling hills, a small patch of woods, and a wide open field that's perfect for watching sunsets. Growing up, my dad would always talk about how this land was a legacy, something passed down from his father and his father before that. To him, it wasn't just dirt and grass, it was a symbol of all the hard work and sacrifices our family had made over the years. My mom felt the same way. She used to say that the land was like another family member, something we all had to take care of and respect. For most of my life, I never thought much about owning the land. To me, it was just home. But 3 years ago, on my 30th birthday, everything changed. It started as a normal birthday celebration, just a small get-together with family and a few close friends. We had cake, shared stories, and laughed about all the embarrassing things I'd done as a kid. I thought that was it, but then my dad stood up, cleared his throat, and handed me an envelope. At first, I thought it was just a card, but when I opened it, I found a legal document inside. My parents had gifted me a portion of the land, 10 acres to be exact. I was shocked. I remember looking up at them, completely speechless. My dad smiled and said, "We wanted to make sure you had a piece of the family legacy. This land is yours now, Tom. Do something good with it." I didn't know what to say. I was touched, overwhelmed even. My parents had always talked about how important the land was to them, and now they were trusting me with a part of it. It felt like more than just a gift, it was a symbol of their faith in me, their way of saying they believed in my future. That night, I sat on the porch and stared out at the land under the moonlight. I started dreaming about what I could do with it. Maybe I'd build a house, a place where I could settle down and start a family someday. Or maybe I'd turn it into a small farm, something sustainable and meaningful. The possibilities felt endless. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a clear direction in life, a purpose. But as much as I loved the idea of building a future on the land, I also understood the responsibility that came with it. This wasn't just any piece of property, it was a part of my family's history. I promised myself that whatever I did, I would honor that legacy. I even started sketching out ideas for a house that would blend into the landscape, something that would feel like it belonged there. Over the next few years, I worked hard to save money for my dream. I took on extra shifts at work, cut back on unnecessary expenses, and avoided big purchases. Every time I felt tired or discouraged, I reminded myself of the land and the future I was working toward. It became my motivation, my reason to keep pushing forward. I'll admit, there were times when I felt overwhelmed. Building a life from scratch isn't easy, especially when you're doing it on your own. But every time I visited the land, I felt a sense of peace and purpose. It was my safe haven, a reminder of what I was working for. I could almost picture the house I wanted to build, a cozy, welcoming home with big windows that let in the sunlight and a porch where I could drink my morning coffee while looking out at the fields. Looking back, that gift from my parents felt like the best thing that had ever happened to me. It was more than just land, it was a chance to create something meaningful, to carry on the family tradition in my own way. At least that's what I thought at the time. I had no idea that this beautiful gift, something that started with so much love and hope, would eventually become the source of the most painful conflict I've ever experienced. But for now, I was just a guy with big dreams and a piece of land that felt like the beginning of something amazing. I had no reason to believe anything would go wrong. After all, my parents had given it to me as a gift, right? What could possibly go wrong with that? After my parents gifted me the 10 acres of land, I felt like I was on a mission. This land wasn't just property, it was my future. I wanted to make my dream of building a house a reality, and I knew it wouldn't happen overnight. So I buckled down and started saving. I took on extra shifts at work, said no to vacations, and stopped spending money on things I didn't really need. My friends joked that I'd turned into a hermit, but I didn't care. Every dollar I saved brought me closer to seeing my dream come to life. At first, everything seemed fine. My parents were supportive, or at least they seemed to be. They'd ask about my plans and nod along as I told them about the house I wanted to build. I even showed them some sketches I'd made, simple ideas for a modest home that wouldn't disrupt the natural beauty of the land. My mom said it sounded nice, and my dad told me to take my time and do it right. But as the months passed, I started noticing little changes in their attitude. It was nothing obvious at first, just small comments here and there. My mom would say things like, "It's so nice seeing the land untouched. It's peaceful, isn't it?" Or my dad would mention how much work it had been to keep the land in good shape over the years. I thought they were just reminiscing, so I didn't read too much into it. Then one evening, during a family dinner, my mom said something that caught me off guard. She started, "It's a little sad not having the whole property together anymore." It felt more complete back then. I didn't know how to respond. The land was still there, just divided into portions. But the way she said it made me feel like I'd done something wrong by accepting their gift. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe she was just being sentimental. Around this time, my cousin Mark started showing an unusual amount of interest in the land. Mark is the type of guy who's always looking for his next big opportunity. He runs a small construction business in town, and while he's good at what he does, he's always been a bit pushy. One day, out of the blue, Mark called me up and said, "Hey Tom, I was thinking, what if you sold me a piece of your land?" I could use it to expand my business. I was stunned. The land wasn't for sale, and I told him as much. Mark, this land was a gift from my parents. It's got sentimental value. I'm not interested in selling. He didn't seem to take the hint. Instead, he kept pushing, saying things like, come on, Tom, it's just a small portion. You'd still have plenty left for whatever you want to do. The more he talked, the more frustrated I became. I knew he didn't see the land the same way I did. To him, it was just a good investment, but to me, it was a piece of my family's history. I stood my ground and told him no. He eventually backed off, but I could tell he wasn't happy about it. After that, things started to feel different. Family gatherings became tense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that people were talking about me when I wasn't around. My parents, who had always been my biggest supporters, started making more pointed comments. My dad would say things like, it's not easy maintaining land like that. We put in years of hard work to make it what it is. And my mom would add, it's just strange not having it all together anymore. It's like a piece of the family is missing. I didn't know what to say. On one hand, I understood where they were coming from. They'd spent years taking care of the land, and I knew it was a big deal for them to give part of it to me. But on the other hand, it felt unfair. They'd gifted me the land willingly, and now it seemed like they were second-guessing their decision. I started to wonder if I'd done something to disappoint them. The tension only grew when I found out Mark had been talking to my parents about the land behind my back. One evening, I overheard him chatting with my dad at a family barbecue. He was making his case again, saying how great it would be for his business and how he could make the land work for everyone. My dad didn't say much, but the fact that he was even entertaining the idea bothered me. It felt like a betrayal. I tried to brush it off and focus on my goal. I kept working, saving, and planning for the day I could finally break ground on my house. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. My parents' comments, Mark's persistence, and the growing tension in our family were starting to weigh on me. Looking back, I wish I'd addressed things head on. Maybe if I'd had an honest conversation with my parents, things would have turned out differently. But at the time, I didn't want to stir the pot. I thought if I just stayed focused and kept my head down, everything would work itself out. I couldn't have been more wrong. It took me 3 years of hard work and sacrifice, but I finally had enough money saved to take the next step. It was time to break ground on my dream house. I can't even describe how excited I was. This wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of everything I had worked for. I wanted something simple but beautiful, a place where I could feel at peace, surrounded by the land I'd grown to love even more. The first step was hiring contractors to survey the land and prepare it for construction. Watching them mark out the foundation and bring in their equipment felt surreal. For the first time, my dream was becoming real, and I couldn't stop smiling. I couldn't wait to show my parents what I was planning, hoping they'd be proud of how far I'd come. But as soon as construction started, their disapproval became impossible to ignore. At first, it was subtle, just little comments here and there. My dad would say things like, "You sure you want to put the house there? That spot has the best view." My mom would chime in with, "It's strange seeing all this change. It doesn't feel like the same land anymore." I tried to reassure them, explaining that I was keeping the house modest and preserving the natural beauty of the land, but nothing I said seemed to make a difference. Then, their comments turned sharper. One day, while the contractors were clearing some brush, my dad stood on the edge of the property with his arms crossed, watching them work. When I walked over to see what he thought, he shook his head and said, "You're ruining it, Tom. This land doesn't need to be changed. It was fine the way it was." That hit me hard. I had always seen the land as a place for my future, a blank canvas where I could build a life. To hear him say I was ruining it felt like a punch to the gut. I reminded him that this was the gift they had given me, but he just muttered, "We didn't think you'd do this." As the weeks went by, their disapproval only grew louder. My mom started bringing up how much work they had put into the land before gifting it to me. "Do you know how many years we spent taking care of this place?" She said one evening. "It wasn't easy, and now it's all changing." I couldn't understand it. This was the same land they had given me with smiles on their faces, telling me to do something good with it. What had changed? I started to wonder if they regretted their decision to give me the land in the first place. But whenever I tried to talk to them about it, the conversation ended in frustration. The breaking point came when I found out they'd been talking to my cousin Mark again. One of the contractors mentioned seeing my dad and Mark walking the property together, discussing alternative uses for the land. My stomach dropped. I knew Mark had been persistent about wanting the land for his construction business, but I never thought my parents would entertain the idea, especially not after I'd made it clear that the land wasn't for sale. That night, I confronted my parents. I asked them point blank if they were discussing the land with Mark behind my back. My dad didn't deny it. "He has some good ideas," he said, almost defensively. "He's got a family to think about, and his business could really benefit from this land. He's willing to pay for it, Tom. It's not like you'd be losing out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Dad, this land was a gift," I said, my voice shaking. "You told me it was part of our family legacy. Now you're saying Mark deserves it more than I do?" My mom jumped in, her tone sharper than I'd ever heard. "Mark's not being selfish, Tom. He's thinking about the bigger picture. You're building a house for yourself, but he's planning something that could benefit the whole family." That was it. I lost my temper. "Selfish? How is building a home selfish? This is my land. You gave it to me. Why are you trying to take it back now?" The argument spiraled out of control. My dad accused me of not appreciating the hard work they had put into the land over the years. My mom said I was being stubborn and short-sighted. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to erase their history or disrespect their efforts, but they wouldn't listen. All they saw was me ruining something they loved. At some point, my dad said something I'll never forget. "Mark deserves that land more than you do, Tom. He's got a family to take care of. What do you have? A dream for a house that only benefits you. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. Those words hurt more than I could have imagined. My parents had always supported me, always believed in me. At least that's what I thought. Hearing them side with Mark, calling my plans selfish, made me question everything. By the time the argument ended, I was too angry and hurt to say anything else. I left their house, slamming the door behind me. As I drove home, I kept replaying their words in my head, trying to make sense of how things had gotten so bad. What started as a dream had turned into a nightmare, and I had no idea how to fix it. I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. It felt like I was living in a bad dream. The tension between me and my parents had been simmering for weeks, but I never expected it to escalate the way it did. Then, one morning, everything came crashing down. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping coffee and going through my to-do list for the day. The construction on my house was moving forward, and I had a meeting scheduled with the contractors to finalize some design details. It was shaping up to be a productive day until I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, I was greeted by a man in a suit holding an envelope. "Are you Thomas?" he asked. I nodded, and he handed me the envelope. "You've been served," he said before walking away. I stood there, stunned, holding the envelope in my hands. My heart was racing, and my mind was already jumping to the worst-case scenario. I closed the door, sat back down at the table, and tore it open. As I read the document inside, my stomach dropped. It was a lawsuit. My parents were suing me. The claim? They wanted the land back, arguing that the gift had been conditional. According to the document, they believed I had violated the spirit of the agreement by starting construction on my house. They alleged that I was misusing the land and demanded its return. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Conditional? Agreement? None of this made sense. When they gave me the land 3 years ago, there was no talk of conditions or agreements. It had been a gift, plain and simple. I even had the legal documents to prove it. The deed transfer was finalized and recorded. But now, they were trying to rewrite history. I felt a mix of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. These were my parents, the people who had raised me, supported me, and encouraged me to build a future. And now they were dragging me into court over the very gift they had given me. The worst part? It didn't stop there. Within hours of receiving the letter, the calls and texts started pouring in. Family members I hadn't heard from in months were suddenly blowing up my phone. At first, I thought they were reaching out to offer support, but I quickly realized that wasn't the case. "Tom, how could you do this to your parents?" One cousin texted. "You're tearing the family apart," another wrote. One voicemail from an aunt was particularly harsh. "You need to do the right thing and give the land back. It's not worth ruining the family over." I couldn't believe it. How had things escalated so quickly? I hadn't even had a chance to process the lawsuit, and now it felt like the entire family was turning against me. The messages were relentless, and no matter how much I tried to explain my side, no one seemed to care. To them, I was the villain, greedy, selfish, and ungrateful. And then there was Mark. Mark had always been vocal about wanting the land, but now he was turning up the heat. He started calling other family members, painting me as the bad guy. He told anyone who would listen that he only wanted a small portion of the land for his business, and that I was being unreasonable and unwilling to compromise. He framed himself as the victim, claiming that I was holding on to the land out of spite and refusing to see the bigger picture. It was infuriating. Mark knew exactly what he was doing, manipulating the situation to make himself look good, while making me look like the problem. The worst part? It was working. More and more family members started siding with him, buying into his narrative that I was selfish and unwilling to work with others. I felt like I was losing control of the situation. No matter how many times I explained that the land was a gift, and that I had every right to use it as I saw fit, no one seemed to care. The truth didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the story my parents and Mark were spinning, a story where I was the villain and they were the victims. I tried to reach out to my parents, hoping to talk things through and find some kind of resolution. But every conversation ended in frustration and anger. My mom kept saying things like, "We didn't give you the land so you could ruin it," and my dad would add, "You're being stubborn, Tom. Why can't you see that this is for the greater good?" It felt like I was talking to strangers. The parents I thought I knew, the ones who had always been there for me, were gone. In their place were two people who seemed determined to take back what they had given me, no matter the cost. I started to feel isolated, like I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. My once close-knit family was now divided, with most of them siding against me. The few who did support me were too afraid to speak up, worried about being dragged into the drama. It felt like I was standing alone, trying to defend myself against a tide of accusations and betrayals. The lawsuit became all I could think about. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't sleep, and couldn't enjoy the progress being made on my house. Every time I looked at the construction site, I felt a mix of pride and dread. This was supposed to be my dream, my future, but now it felt like a battleground. As the weeks went on, I realized there was no easy way out of this. My parents weren't backing down, and Mark was only adding fuel to the fire. If I wanted to keep the land, and my dream, I would have to fight for it. But even as I prepared for the legal battle ahead, I couldn't shake the sadness. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about trust, betrayal, and a family falling apart over something that should have brought us closer together. And the worst part, deep down, I wasn't sure if anything would ever be the same again. I never thought I'd find myself in a courtroom, let alone fighting against my own parents. But as much as I hated the idea, I knew I had no choice. They weren't backing down, and I wasn't about to give up the land that had been gifted to me. So reluctantly, I hired a lawyer and started preparing for the battle ahead. The first meeting with my lawyer was sobering. She reviewed the lawsuit, listened to my side of the story, and asked a lot of questions about the land and my relationship with my parents. When I told her there had never been any mention of conditions when the land was gifted, she nodded but warned me that family agreements, even unwritten ones, could complicate things. Your parents are arguing that this wasn't just a gift, she explained. They're claiming there was an understanding that the land would be used in a way that benefited the whole family. It's going to come down to proving that no such agreement existed. I felt a wave of frustration. How was I supposed to prove a negative? The land had been a birthday gift, no strings attached. I had the deed transfer to back me up, but the idea of fighting my parents in court still felt wrong. These were the people who had raised me, who had taught me about honesty and hard work. And now they were twisting the truth to take back what they had willingly given. As the case dragged on, things got even messier. My parents' lawyer argued that the gift had been part of an unspoken family tradition, and that I had violated this tradition by building a house for my own use, instead of something that benefited the family as a whole. They claimed I was being selfish and disregarding their wishes. Hearing those arguments made my blood boil. I wanted to stand up in court and shout, "That's not true." But I had to stay calm and let my lawyer handle it. She pointed out that the deed transfer was clear and legally binding. "A gift is a gift," she said in court. "There's no evidence of any conditions or agreements, written or otherwise." Still, the process was exhausting. Every hearing, every legal document, every discussion with my lawyer drained me. And outside of court, the family drama continued to escalate. My phone was still blowing up with calls and texts from relatives who had taken sides. Most of them supported my parents, convinced that I was being unreasonable. I felt like I was on an island, completely alone. Then, in the middle of all this chaos, my lawyer uncovered something that changed everything. She had been digging through court records and financial documents related to the case when she found evidence that Mark, my cousin, was financing the lawsuit. At first, I couldn't believe it. Why would Mark be paying for my parents' legal fees? But as I thought about it, the pieces started to fall into place. Mark had always been vocal about wanting the land for his construction business. He had tried to buy it from me, and when I said no, he started pressuring my parents. Now it seemed he was pulling the strings behind the scenes, using the lawsuit as a way to get what he wanted. When my lawyer showed me the proof, I felt a mix of anger and devastation. Mark wasn't just some distant relative stirring up trouble. He was my cousin, someone I had grown up with and trusted. And now he was actively working against me, manipulating my parents and fueling this entire conflict. I confronted my parents about it the next day. I went to their house, holding the documents my lawyer had uncovered. "Did you know Mark is paying for your lawsuit?" I asked, my voice shaking. They looked at each other, their expressions a mix of guilt and defensiveness. My dad finally spoke. He offered to help us out, he said. He said it was only fair, considering everything. "Fair?" I said, my voice rising. "You're letting Mark use you to take the land from me. How can you not see that he's manipulating you?" My mom looked down at her hands, avoiding my gaze. "He said he'd pay us back for the trouble," she admitted quietly. "We thought it was the right thing to do, Tom. You're being so stubborn, and Mark just wants to use the land for something that benefits everyone." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had let Mark convince them that I was the problem, that I was the selfish one. I felt a deep, aching betrayal, not just because of the lawsuit, but because my parents had chosen to side with Mark over their own son. "This isn't about what's right or fair," I said, my voice breaking. "This is about Mark getting what he wants, no matter who he has to hurt, and you're letting him destroy our family to do it." My dad started to say something, but I didn't want to hear it. I turned and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind me. As I drove home, tears streamed down my face. I felt like I had lost everything: the support of my parents, the trust of my family, and the sense of peace I once felt about the land. The lawsuit continued, but from that point on, it felt different. I wasn't just defending the land anymore. I was fighting to protect myself from people I once thought I could trust. The betrayal cut deep, and no matter what the outcome was, I knew things would never be the same. When the day finally came for the judge to deliver the ruling, I could barely breathe. The court case had dragged on for what felt like forever, consuming every part of my life. I sat in the courtroom, hands clenched tightly together, waiting for the decision that would determine not just the future of the land, but also my relationship with my family. The judge began by acknowledging the complexity of family disputes, but then she cut straight to the point. She ruled in my favor. The gift of the land was legally binding, with no evidence of conditions or agreements that I had violated. The deed transfer was clear, and my parents had no legal claim to take it back. I should have felt relieved. I should have been happy. But as I sat there, hearing the judge's words, all I felt was exhaustion. The victory didn't feel like a triumph, it felt hollow. I had spent months fighting a battle I never wanted, against the very people who were supposed to support me. To make matters worse, the judge also ordered my parents to pay my legal fees. It was a fair decision, after all. They had started the lawsuit, but I knew it would only make things more complicated. My parents weren't wealthy, and I could already imagine how they'd spin this as another way I had hurt them. After the ruling, I walked out of the courtroom feeling numb. My lawyer patted me on the back and told me I had done the right thing by standing up for myself, but her words didn't sink in. I couldn't stop thinking about how my parents had looked during the hearing, angry, defeated, and distant. It didn't feel like a win. It felt like I had lost something I could never get back. The fallout from the case was immediate. My extended family was completely divided. Some of them reached out to tell me they were proud of me for standing my ground. They said I was brave for not letting myself be bullied, even by my own parents, but others weren't so kind. I started getting messages from relatives accusing me of being heartless. How could you put your parents through this? One text read, they gave you that land out of love, and now you've ruined everything. Another message said, you've torn this family apart, Tom. I hope it was worth it. It was exhausting trying to navigate the emotions and opinions of so many people. No matter what I said or did, it seemed like someone was unhappy with me. I tried to remind myself that I had done what was necessary to protect myself and my future, but it was hard not to feel like the bad guy. The hardest part, though, was cutting ties with my parents and Mark. After everything that had happened, I knew I couldn't keep pretending that things could go back to the way they were. The trust was gone, and I didn't see how I could rebuild it, not after the lawsuit, the lies, and the betrayal. I made the decision to distance myself, at least for the time being. I stopped attending family gatherings and blocked Mark's number on my phone. As for my parents, I wrote them a letter explaining how I felt. I told them I loved them and always would, but that I needed time and space to heal. I didn't know if they would understand, but I had to protect myself. I couldn't keep letting their actions hurt me. The first few weeks after the court case were some of the loneliest of my life. The land, which had once felt like a symbol of hope and possibility, now felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. I'd walk the property and think about all the good memories I had with my family, Christmas dinners, summer barbecues, quiet evenings watching the sunset, and wonder if I'd ever feel that connection again. But slowly, I started to rebuild. I threw myself into the construction of my house, pouring my energy into making it everything I had dreamed it could be. I worked with the contractors to design a space that felt peaceful and welcoming, a place where I could start fresh. It wasn't easy, but it gave me something to focus on, something to look forward to. I also leaned on the few family members who supported me. One of my cousins, who had stayed neutral during the conflict, reached out to check on me. She told me she admired my strength and offered to help me reconnect with other relatives who had stayed out of the drama. It wasn't the same as having my parents' support, but it reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel a sense of peace. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to move forward. The land was mine, and with it, I had the opportunity to create something new, something that reflected who I was and what I valued. Cutting ties with my parents and Mark was one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make, but it was also necessary. Sometimes, the people we love the most can hurt us in ways we never expect. And while it's painful to let go, it's even more painful to keep holding on when it's breaking you. Looking back, I wish things had turned out differently. I wish my parents had trusted me and believed in my vision for the land. I wish Mark had respected my boundaries instead of trying to manipulate me. But wishing doesn't change the past. All I can do now is focus on the future and hope that someday healing is possible. It's been a year since the court case ended, and my dream home is finally complete. Standing in the middle of it, I feel a mix of emotions. The house is everything I imagined it would be, cozy, peaceful, and perfectly suited to the land. Big windows let in the sunlight and offer stunning views of the rolling fields and woods. The porch, where I've already spent hours with a cup of coffee in hand, feels like the perfect spot to watch the world go by. But as much as I love the house, I can't help but feel a bittersweet twinge whenever I think about how it all came to be. The land, this home, what should have been a beautiful chapter in my life became one of the hardest experiences I've ever faced. And while I've tried to move on, the memories of the lawsuit, the arguments, and the fractured family relationships still linger. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on what happened. When my parents first gave me the land, I never imagined it would lead to such pain and conflict. Back then, it felt like a gift of love, a way for them to pass down a piece of our family's history. But somewhere along the way, things got complicated. Money and property have a strange way of doing that. They can bring out the best in people, but they can also bring out the worst. I've realized that family dynamics are fragile, especially when pride, tradition, and expectations get involved. My parents loved the land, and I think they struggled with the idea of letting it go, even after they gifted it to me. Add Mark into the mix, with his constant pressure and manipulation, and it created a perfect storm. I don't think my parents ever meant for things to get so out of hand, but once they started down that path, they couldn't or wouldn't stop. The hardest lesson I've learned through all of this is that sometimes you have to choose your own peace over pleasing others. For most of my life, I tried to be the kind of person who made everyone happy. I avoided conflict, kept my head down, and did what I thought was expected of me. But this situation forced me to stand up for myself, even when it meant disappointing people I cared about. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but looking back, I know it was necessary. Not everything has been bad, though. A few months after the court case, one of my cousins, someone who had stayed quiet during the drama, reached out to me. She said she was sorry for everything I had been through and that she wished she'd spoken up sooner. We ended up talking for hours, and it felt good to have someone in my corner. She even offered to help me reconnect with some relatives who had stayed neutral or supported me quietly. It's a slow process, but I'm starting to rebuild those relationships one step at a time. As for my parents and Mark, I've kept my distance. It wasn't an easy decision, but I needed time to heal. I don't know if we'll ever get back to the way things were, but I'm hopeful that someday we can at least have a civil relationship. For now, though, I'm focusing on creating a new life for myself, one that's rooted in love, respect, and boundaries. One of the things that keeps me going is the idea of building a new legacy on this land. I don't just want it to be a place where I live, I want it to be a place where love and kindness grow. Maybe someday I'll start a family here. I'll teach them about the importance of standing up for themselves, but also about the value of forgiveness and understanding. I want this land to be a symbol of hope, not conflict. This morning, as I walked through my house, I felt a sense of pride. Not just for the home I built, but for the person I've become. A year ago, I was scared, hurt, and unsure of myself. Now, I feel stronger. I know what I want, and I'm not afraid to fight for it. I stepped out onto the porch and looked out at the same land that had caused so much pain, but also brought me so much growth. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a golden glow over the fields. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. This was my home, my sanctuary, and my fresh start. As I stood there, I made a promise to myself. I would create a new legacy on this land, one rooted in love, respect, and understanding. I would honor the past, but I wouldn't let it hold me back. This was my chance to start over, and I wasn't going to waste it. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that life isn't about holding on to what was, it's about building what could be. And for me, that starts right here, on this land, with this home, and with a heart full of hope for the future.